Welcome, learner. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really intense source material. We're looking at escalating global tensions, especially around the war in Ukraine.
And the sources we're analyzing argue there's the profound economic and strategic consequences from recent U.S. and NATO actions. We're talking about highly charged information.
Extremely charged. There are explicit nuclear threats in here. So, just to be clear, our goal is not to endorse any of this, but to really impartially pull out the core arguments for you.
Exactly. Our mission is to be your objective guide. We're going to extract the key arguments, the specific threats being detailed, and how the sources claim all of this is, rewriting the global financial and strategic map.
And the main source, the one this all centers on, is a really long interview with Sergey Karaganov. He's a well-known Russian public intellectual, and he's been a political advisor to Vladimir Putin for a very long time.
And his statements are, to put it mildly, explicit.
Yeah. So we'll touch on a few other global hotspots the material mentions, but we have to pivot quickly to the main event, the central claim here, that Russia is actively right now considering nuclear strikes against major European nations.
Right. So to set the stage, the source material does highlight these other flashpoints, things that represent, serious downside risk on their own.
Like the threat of strikes on Iran. The sources were anticipating that, and the risk was that the country could just, quote, fall apart and become Libya.
Which would destabilize the whole region. And the sources detailed the potential retaliation. Iran could hit Israel with conventional strikes, maybe even overwhelm the Iron Dome.
Or, and this is the big one for the global economy, they could target energy infrastructure in the Gulf countries.
An oil shock.
A massive one. It would cause an immediate global economic crisis.
Then the sources bring up something a bit stranger, this suggested U.S. move to acquire Greenland from Denmark.
Which sounds odd, but the analysis is about the precedent it sets.
Exactly. It establishes this really dangerous idea that if I have the power, I get to take what I want.
A kind of 19th century power politics. So if the U.S., a NATO member, does that to Denmark, another member, what happens to the alliance?
Well, the sources argue it would effectively end NATO. I mean, a defensive alliance can't work if one member just acts aggressively toward another. It shatters the entire foundation of mutual trust.
And the last one they mention is Venezuela. Regime change there, creating chaos, a migrant crisis, the usual playbook.
Right. But what's so fascinating is how the source presents these three issues, Iran, Greenland, Venezuela, as, huge risks, but ultimately secondary.
They're just the warm-up act?
They are. They're framed as distractions from the main global confrontation that the sources insist everyone is just completely overlooking.
Okay, so let's get to that central conflict. The sources argue that none of this comes close to the existential threat that's brewing in Eastern Europe. The headline, everyone's missing, they claim, is that Russia is actively considering nuclear strikes on Europe.
And they name names, specifically the UK and Germany.
Yeah, this is where we have to turn directly to that Karaganov interview. He states, and this is a direct quote, that if the war in Ukraine continues for a year or two more, Russia will eliminate the UK and Germany with nuclear weapons.
Point blank.
Yeah.
That's the language coming from a recognized Kremlin advisor.
It's shocking. Do the sources say if this is a unified position in Moscow, or is this just Karaganov being extreme?
The analysis really focuses on him as the voice of a new, hardening doctrine. And they detail the strategic rationale. I mean, it's cold. Germany is the economic engine of Europe.
And London is the banking center of the West.
Right. And crucially, both host large American military bases. They're dual-purpose targets.
But Germany is a non-nuclear power.
Oh.
Targeting them changes all the rules.
It does. And that's the point. The sources say Russia has publicly rewritten its nuclear strategy. The new doctrine includes using nuclear weapons against countries acting as proxies for nuclear-armed powers.
So if you're not a nuclear power yourself, but you're seen as running a proxy war for one, you're now, fair game?
That's the term they use, fair game.
Yeah.
It's less a deterrent threat and more like a declaration of a new aggressive policy.
And they're backing this up with actions. The sources mentioned the recent use of hypersonic missiles against Kyiv. What was the message there?
It was a very deliberate message of escalation. The analysis says the message was, you've pushed us too far. And the unspoken part, the follow-up, is that the next hypersonic missile,
Which no one can stop.
which no one can reliably intercept, right, that next one will have a nuclear warhead on it, and it's coming at you, Europe. It's an explicit warning of both capability and intent.
So if we pull the lens back, the sources argue this is all happening because Moscow doesn't see this as a Russia-Ukraine war at all.
Not at all. They see it as a proxy war, one that's being managed by external, non-Ukrainian interests. They believe nothing that has happened there since 1991 has really been about Ukraine.
And they cite specific evidence for this. The claim is non-Ukrainians have been, calling the shots for decades. They point to the 2014 coup and a clip of George Soros and Chrystia Freeland.
Right, where they discuss how Ukrainian leadership was touched somehow by open society or got scholarships from Soros's organizations.
The implication, of course, being that the entire leadership structure is controlled by outside foreign interests. And this leads to what the sources call a fatal Western miscalculation about Russia itself.
Exactly. The sources argue that Western leaders are profoundly ignorant when they dismiss Russia as just a gas station with nuclear weapons.
Right. They emphasize Russia's real strategic depth. It's geographically enormous, bigger than China and India combined.
It has the deepest energy reserves, high uranium enrichment capacity, huge amounts of gold, silver, timber, fertile farmland. This incredible resource density is what the sources call the siren that has drawn invaders for centuries.
So to underestimate that power is just strategically reckless.
And this road to collision, they argue, didn't start in 2022. It goes way back. Back to 2001, when NATO rejected Putin's request to join the alliance.
A decision that, even at the time, some predicted would guarantee a collision with the West.
And after that, NATO just moved east for 21 years, pushing and pushing until, from the Russian perspective, this conflict was inevitable.
The sources then point to what they call extreme recklessness from the West since the war started, almost like a death wish. First up is the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline.
They claim that the Ukraine destroyed the European economy by cutting off cheap natural gas. But strategically, it was a message to Russia that there are no limits. It normalized state-sponsored sabotage of critical infrastructure.
It was a very dangerous precedent, and the second act of recklessness.
The claim that the Ukrainian government, with targeting assistance from the CIA, has tried to assassinate President Putin multiple times.
I mean, if that's even partially true, then all the old rules are gone. Trying to take out the head of a nuclear-armed state is an insane escalation.
It is. The sources conclude that U.S. foreign policy leaders are, and this is very strong, derogatory language, weak, unwise, low IQ people who are leading the West way over our heads.
And this recklessness didn't just affect military stability. It had an immediate and maybe permanent impact on the global financial system. So let's shift to the economic consequences, which is something you should really be tracking.
The sources argue the U.S. response in 2022 was the single most unwise thing any administration has done, specifically kicking Russia out of SWIFT and the mass seizure of Russian assets.
Which the sources just call stealing personal property.
Exactly.
So what was the critical consequence of that?
The core argument is that it sabotaged the U.S. dollar status as the world's reserve currency, the petrodollar. As soon as the U.S. showed it would use the system as a political weapon and just confiscate assets, every other major power changed its thinking.
So if you're sitting in Beijing or Riyadh or New Delhi, your dollar holdings suddenly look less like an asset and more like a political hostage.
Precisely. And the sources give us a concrete metric to watch. They point out that gold was trading around $1,700 an ounce in February 2022. Today, it's trading around $4,600 an ounce.
That's a staggering increase. But why is the gold price the key indicator here and not just general inflation?
Because, the sources argue, gold is non-fiat and it's non-confiscatable. You can't freeze a bar of gold sitting in your own vault. So this price explosion is presented as direct evidence that major global players are dumping U.S. treasuries and buying gold because they think the dollar system is no longer safe.
And the other immediate consequence of the sanctions was this new alliance between Russia and China.
Right. The sanctions basically forced Russia into what the sources call a durable alliance with China. And think about what that creates. The world's largest economy, China, paired with the world's largest resource base, Russia.
A unified Eurasia, something Richard Nixon worked for decades to prevent.
Exactly. The sources call that an actual threat to U.S. interests.
Okay, to really understand why this conflict is so intense, we have to look at the philosophy behind it. Karaganov's view on Europe's decline.
This is where it gets deeply ideological. Karaganov sees the war's ultimate goal as the total defeat of Europe, which he describes as the historical source of all ills and all sources of evil in the history of humanity.
Wow. So world wars, colonialism.
All of it. And now, in his view, the export of anti-human values. It's a total ideological rejection of modern Europe.
So how does he see Europe's current leaders?
As complete failures. He says they're in a moral, political, economic, etc. decline, and he specifically blames what he calls anti-meritocracy, which he ties back to the post-1968 student revolutions that he thinks destroyed European competence.
Yet how does that view of them as failures connect to the nuclear threats?
It leads to this idea of strategic parasitism. He accuses European leaders of believing war will never come to their territory because they hide behind the U.S. So Russia's task, in his view, is to bring them to their senses, with the threat of nuclear use. He thinks it's the only thing they'll respond to.
And yet he also argues the sanctions have been a blessing for Russia. How does that make any sense?
It's a key part of the argument. He claims the sanctions forced Russia to purge its comprador elites and throw out the fifth column.
Can you define those terms for us?
Sure. Comprador elites are local power brokers who are loyal to foreign capital, not their own country. A fifth column is just an internal group that's disloyal to the state. So by getting rid of them, Karaganov says Russia returned to its true culture, its soul, and became a nation of warriors.
So he's framing this whole thing as a kind of necessary civilizational cleansing.
Absolutely. He argues Russia is sincerely leaving its 300-year focus on Europe behind and becoming a Eurasian nation, one that will balance China in a new four-power system with the U.S. and India.
And the path forward
Is clear, he says. If hostility continues, it goes from conventional attacks on Europe to waves of nuclear strikes.
And the most chilling part is that he says he's actually criticizing Putin for being too cautious. He thinks using a nuclear weapon might be a necessary sin to prevent a much larger Third World War.
At the end of the day, what you see is this story of a perceived self-destructing West meeting a newly aggressive, ideologically driven Russia. The greatest danger, the sources suggest, isn't just the Russian threats. It's that they are combined with what is described as a self-destructive Western economic policy that has cornered a great power while simultaneously, maybe fatally, undermining the dollar.
So we've covered a lot. From the breakdown of NATO to alleged assassination attempts to the self-sabotage of the dollar, all culminating in this public threat of nuclear elimination against the UK and Germany. So here's the final thought for you. If the sources are correct and the US dollar's reserve status is actively being eroded by these geopolitical decisions, what does that soaring price of gold tell us? Not just about the future of money, but about the real level of trust a power like China now has in the stability and the wisdom of the entire Western-led financial order.